Hello, and welcome to the fourth webinar for those who've been invited to submit final applications to CLEAR's Digitizing Hidden Collections, Amplifying Unheard Voices program this year. I'm Louisa Quatigra, Managing Director at CLEAR, and today's session will focus on staffing and budget. We're going to start off with some introductions, first to this platform, and then to our presenter for today's webinar. Here are some notes about using Zoom during this session. A live transcript is being generated if you'd like to utilize it. To turn on this feature, click the CC Show Captions button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. However, you're welcome to use chat for general introductions and conversation. If a chat box isn't already displaying on your Zoom screen, you can hover your mouse towards the bottom of the screen and open it manually. In order to send a message to everyone, remember to change the default from all panelists and hosts to everyone. We ask that you use the separate Q&A or question and answer box to ask questions. This can be opened the same way as the chat box. Feel free to follow along with questions as they come in and like or upvote them to let us know that it would be helpful for you to have them answered live. We will do our best to answer all of the questions, and we will also share written responses to these questions following the webinar. The session is being recorded. The slides, questions and answers, recording, and transcript will all be made available on the Apply for an Award page of our website in the next 2 weeks.
Our team would like to center today's conversation by acknowledging that as residents of the United States, we are speaking to you from unceded land of many Indigenous peoples. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize the original and current caretakers of the land, water, air where I live, the Shawnee and Osage peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on their homelands and ask you to join me in acknowledging all Indigenous communities as well, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. May this acknowledgement remind us of our shared commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. During today's session, our host will dig into staffing and budget. We've allotted 90 minutes total for today, and we'll pause around 2:45 p.m. Eastern for a quick break during the content. We're hoping for an engaging conversation around staffing considerations and training needs, offering a compelling case for the need in a budget narrative, and using a budget narrative to build a justified budget detail. The plan is to reserve about 25 minutes for Q&A near the end of this session. Both the session host and CLEAR staff will be available to answer questions at that time. So while you may pose questions throughout using the Q&A box, keep in mind that we might not get to questions as they're asked, but staff will be keeping track and will circle back to any unanswered questions during the dedicated Q&A.
So we want to launch a poll to gauge how you're feeling today about the topic on staffing and budget. In today's session, you'll learn more about the skills and strategies you need to complete the following application tasks: the project details, capacity tasks, which includes the resumes and or job description uploads, the project details, indicating the need for support tasks, which includes subcontracts, budget detail, and budget narrative uploads. So we're going to launch the poll. Oop, hold on. No, wrong one. No, that was the wrong one. There we go. Yeah. The project details. We're going to probably have to scrap that because it has information from rights, ethics, and reuse on it, on the 4A1. Hold on.
1 second, Sharon, I can help.
Okay. You want to switch it out real quick?
Yeah.
All right.
Machine. Or no.
Now it's ready? Okay. Um,
I've selected launch, but I don't know if it's appearing.
yeah, it's probably
Okay.
not. No, it's not. Actually, I don't see it. It's, we'll just do the second one at the end because this one has information on rights at, here we go. Okay, let's try it again. There we go. We got it. Is it showing?
For some reason it's not showing up, so we can move on without the poll, I think.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, we'll do a second one. Hopefully you will learn a lot in this session. Before we hand it over to our host for today, we want to share some important details and reminders as you prepare your budgets for the final application. During the technical review of initial applications, we noticed the number of disallowed costs in the initial budget narratives. So we allowed these budgets to move to the final round. However, it's important to note that any disallowed costs will not move forward in the final application during the tech review. So you want to review the comments that you receive from your review panel staff and the review Appendix A of the application guidelines for allowable and disallowed costs as you prepare your budgets for the final application. We also noticed the amount requested on applications did not always match the budget narrative. So if all these numbers do not match or fall outside the allowable range for this grant, the application will be disqualified in the final application round. Now that we've cleared a few of those things up, we're going to turn things over to our host, Megan Friedel, lead archivist of Rare and Distinctive Collections at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And we're going to get a moment just to let Megan share their slides and get oriented.
All right, give me just a quick minute here. Okay. Welcome, everybody, and thank you to Clear for having me do this session. So I just want to give a little background on why I'm here. I am a Clear grant reviewer for another Clear grant, not for Digitizing Hidden Collections. So I'm speaking from my experience as a grant reviewer, things that I've noticed as well as other grant reviewers have noticed when it comes to staffing and budget. And I've also written many grants, and this is an area that I think can be the most intimidating for grant writers, especially for new grant writers who've never written one before. So hopefully this demystifies it a little bit. Let's see, make sure I can move my screen. There we go. So generally what we're going to be covering today are staffing considerations, building a compelling case for need in your budget narrative, using that budget narrative to justify all of your costs and your budget details, and then connecting those budgets back to the community-centered outcomes and the core values of CLEAR's Digitizing Hidden Collections grant funds. So I've included QR codes on each of these slides. I find that easier when you're watching a webinar on Zoom to do that than trying to frantically type in a web address. So feel free to use them. I just want to quickly touch on the core values for core, oh dear, we seem to be missing the slide that I had there. So I want to touch really quickly on those core values and just mention that everything that you're writing, including staffing and budget, should relate back to those core values, especially broad representation, authentic and equitable partnerships, and also the sustaining infrastructure. I don't have those in front of me, so I'm probably not saying those correctly. I thought I had a slide in there about that. Apologies. So there we go. Broad representation, authentic partnerships, and sustainable infrastructures. Those are the really key ones to be looking at in your staffing and budget narratives and your budget details. So we're also going to be going through the application guidelines through those sections that Sharon mentioned. So again, I highly recommend if you don't have those up right now, pull them up because it's going to be a lot easier to follow along if you've got those guidelines in front of you. And I wanted to start with a couple general things to remember. What I always tell people when they're writing grants is if you can follow the directions in the grant, you're going to be a successful grant applicant. So that's the really key thing. For budget and staffing, there are some really detailed, lengthy explanations for instructions and also guidelines in the application guidelines. Please read those thoroughly. I strongly recommend having that side by side with your grant application as you're putting it together. Don't forget, you can always reach out to CLEAR program officers if you've got questions. Do make sure you're completing all of the required sections and uploading all of the required documents that are listed in the application guidelines. And as Sharon said, make sure that you're using Appendix A to review all the allowable and disallowed costs. And we'll go through those towards the end of this presentation. And there's one other thing to keep in mind. There are two templates that I'm going to be talking about, budget detail template and looks like the poll just came up finally. There we go. There's a budget detail template and then also a budget narrative template. The budget detail template is required. The budget narrative template is not required, but strongly recommended. I'll go through those in detail, but please consider using them. They're very, very helpful, or definitely use the budget detail one. It's much easier than trying to put a spreadsheet together from scratch. There we go. So we're going to start with the first task that we're covering today, which is the project details capacity. Again, if you want to use that QR code to link straight to the application guidelines, I'd highly recommend that. So the question that you're answering in this part of the application is, what capacity and strengths will you bring to this project, and what capacity and strengths do you hope to build? So that can be a little confusing in terms of how that relates to staffing and budget. What you really want to do, and I know this is difficult to be concise in 700 words, but focus on what your team's current strengths. So by team, I mean if you're a single applicant, your institution, your applicant institution. If you're a collaborator, if this is a collaborative grant, both the lead applicant and then all of their collaborators, focus on what your strengths are, what you're going to bring to the table in order to complete this project, and how that additional staffing and budget provided by the grant funds could potentially build future capacity in that team to continue to do similar work or to continue to build on other digital projects. Make sure you're relating those staffing and budget requests back to those core values that I mentioned before. So please make sure you're always rereading and going back to those core values for the Digitizing Hidden Collections grant. And note specifically, this is really important, where staffing and budget requests will support underrepresented groups. There's a long list in the application guidelines of who that might include. So that could be including but not limited to persons with disabilities, LGBTQIA plus individuals, people of Hispanic or Latin, Black, or African American, Asian, Middle Eastern, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander, First Nations, American Indian, or Alaska Native descent. Remember, that's not a limited, that's not a, it's not limited just to those groups. And then also note any related past projects, any project that your institution or your team has done that can demonstrate your capacity to succeed. This is all really related back to those staffing and budget needs. And you also want to demonstrate post-grant sustainability. How is this project going to, again, build your future capacity? I highly recommend when you're going through each of these task areas in the application guidelines to be reading through not only the task instructions, the question itself, but look at those insights that are just below the application box or the answer box. Because it really helps you highlight what CLEAR is actually looking for. So CLEAR is looking in this instance for projects that show evidence that the plan is appropriate to your organization, that'll be sustainable after the funding is spent, and especially CLEAR is looking for projects that are going to create new opportunities for stakeholders to grow in their experience and increase their potential to undertake this kind of work. One thing to really keep in mind, and this is something that we see pretty often in CLEAR grant reviews, you need to make sure that if you are going to be applying grant funds to permanent staff who are already employed by the institution or maybe permanently employed as a part of this grant, that the work that they're doing that's supported by the grant funds is directly related to the project. So it can't support, say, your current admin assistant who's also doing, it couldn't cover the whole salary for an admin assistant who is doing other work in addition to the grant. It has to be specifically related to the grant. And that cost has to be appropriately justified in the budget narrative, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So as a part of this section, what you're going to be needing to do is upload resumes and or job descriptions. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. So what to upload? For each of the named principal investigators, so those are the project leads. Principal investigator is a grant word that may not be familiar to non-academic institutions. So that's the other term that can be used interchangeably as project lead. So these need to be brief. You're not uploading, say, your 15-page CV. You want to upload a very brief resume or CV that highlights the experience that's related to this project to give the CLEAR reviewers a sense for whether you've got that capacity right now to really support and sustain this program during its duration and perhaps afterwards as well. And then again, any key project staff who are going to be covered by the funds, resumes need to be uploaded for them as well. At least one upload is required and up to 5 documents are allowed. So keep that in mind when you are putting together your staffing list. You need to make sure that you've at least got one. That should be the lead applicant, and then up to 5. For new positions that are going to be supported with grant funds, we're well aware that you're not going to have the resume in hand, perhaps, for that person. So what we're looking for is instead a job description that includes duties, also the required and preferred qualifications, the pay rate. This is really important. I'm going to talk on the next slide about this a little bit. And then, if applicable, the benefits package, and also the term of the position if it's not going to be permanent in the long term. You can also upload, if you're going to be hiring student employees as part of this project, upload the student employee job description. You can just upload one for that to cover, if you're going to be hiring 5 or 6 job descriptions, just upload that, or jobs rather, just upload that one job description. So as I said, just those can all be uploaded as one PDF, but the resumes and CVs need to be uploaded separately. Okay, pay rate. This is really important, and this is something that comes up a lot in grant reviews. We do look really carefully at pay rate for any staff who are going to be paid as part of the project. And equity is a main component of CLEAR grants. So the pay rate does need to be equitable, and it does need to be competitive. You need to demonstrate that you're acknowledging the cost of living in your geographic location, that this is going to be a competitive rate that supports cost of living, is equitable with similar positions elsewhere. Demonstrate that you've done that work, and also acknowledge the precarity of temporary labor. That has been a major point that, especially in my profession, the archives profession, we've been exploring deeply over the last decade or so. And you need to acknowledge what you're doing in order to support that person during this temporary labor. And then another key thing, which Sharon also mentioned, any salary, wages, and benefits that you're mentioning in this part of your uploads has to match what's in the budget detail narrative, the budget detail spreadsheet, and also in the budget narrative. Make sure that your numbers across the board are matching everywhere in your grant application, because we do notice those discrepancies, and that can occasionally or often cause concern. So moving on to the next task. The next task is the project details, the need for support. So again, if you would like to follow along with the QR code, or I believe that would be on about page 30 of the application guidelines. So there are a couple required elements. I keep mentioning those budget details and budget narratives. We're going to get into that, but we're also going to talk through the 700-word answer to the question, why do you need support, from CLEAR's program to undertake this project? So this is your time to justify why you are actually asking for a financial support from CLEAR's Digitizing Hidden Collections grant. So a couple key points on guidance. You've got to really touch on, as much as you can in 700 words, the following things. How does this fund, how do these funds and the project that you're undertaking, how is it going to support digitizing hidden collections' overall mission and its core values? Again, relating always back to those core values. And your own institution as a lead applicant, or your collaborators' institutions, how do those institutions' mission and values match digitizing hidden collections theme and core values? They may not, especially in this day and age. And if so, maybe acknowledge that and talk about why it's so important to have this grant in the context of those missions and values. Another really key thing that I think some people kind of gloss over is, why are these grant funds essential to you to complete this project? Why can't you complete these with the funding that your organization currently has? You really need to demonstrate that need. And then if you've got collaborators, make sure that you are documenting and referring to how the collaborators are committed to supporting the project. So part of the application is uploading those reference support letters, or those support letters. Go back, look at those, take out a key quote or two from those support letters, and make sure that they're really kind of underlying the argument that you're making about why you need support from CLEAR's program to undertake this project. Some continued guidance. If your project is building off any existing budgets that your institution has for building digital collections, talk about that. Talk about how this is different, how this kind of expands the scope. We do recognize, however, that oftentimes applications are coming from institutions that have never done this work. That's okay. But you might just mention that and say, this is a new area for us. We want to build in this way. Do talk about whether there are going to be any plans for sustained funding post-grant. For smaller organizations, for some nonprofits, other organizations, sometimes there may not be, but acknowledge that. You can talk about whether this is it will be a final project, no work going to be done past that point. That's okay, acknowledge that, but also maybe talk about how this might lead to something else if you can't kind of build onto the digital collection. Private foundations have some key considerations. If a private foundation is the lead applicant, we do need to see additional justification for why those funds are actually needed. You really do need to address, and I'll talk about this elsewhere as well, why the foundation, why your major funding sources for your foundation cannot be used for this project, why funding is necessary for this. So you do need to mention that if you're a private foundation applicant. And then again, if you are working on a collaborative project, you need to demonstrate authentic and equitable partnerships. Again, one of the core values for this program. So what do we mean by that? The core value for authentic partnerships means that the project includes meaningful engagement with underserved communities whose stories the source materials tell. Again, that's the whole theme of this program. And then also you're building inclusive teams across institutional and geographic boundaries. That is really key. And in terms of staffing and budget support, what that might mean and translate to is, are your collaborators being equitably compensated for their project time? Whether that's in honoraria, whether that is in grant funds for staffing time, are you being equitable? And if not, discuss why, but really consider that equitable share. So moving on to some of the uploads that are associated with this, I keep talking about the budget detail template. So the budget detail template is required. It's linked in the application guidelines in the section that we're talking about, the project details need for support. Do not create your own spreadsheets. These are preloaded with all the fields that you're going to need. There are very, very detailed instructions for use in the application guidelines that include how to use some of the drop-down menus for salary, wages, benefits, consultant fees, etc. So do make sure that you're following those very, very closely. And make sure that everything you add into the budget detail spreadsheet is mentioned and justified in the budget narrative. Oftentimes what we see in grants is either the budget details are very, very detailed, and then the budget narrative doesn't reflect everything that's in those, doesn't justify those costs, or conversely, the budget detail spreadsheet is very, very skimpy, and there's more costs that aren't in that budget detail spreadsheet in the budget narrative. Avoid both of those things. Make sure your budget detail spreadsheet fully matches what's in the budget justification narrative, and we're going to talk about that narrative in just a second. There's some additional instructions on CLEAR's apply for an award page, and I've listed that QR code there. If you need help in navigating this, really, really look closely at those instructions, both in the application guidelines and those additional instructions. So a few things to note for that budget detail spreadsheet. If you've got a 1-year project, there's a 12-month spreadsheet there for you. If you've got a 2-year project, there's a 24-month template you'll use. And again, if you've got a 36-month project, there's one there for you as well. Choose the one that suits the length of your project. You're going to want to break those, or they are broken into 12-month reporting periods, which is key because that's going to go with your reporting, your reports that you're going to be submitting on your progress of your outcomes. Each line item, as I mentioned before, has to be assigned a heading from a drop-down list. So again, the drop-downs are salary and wages, fringe benefits, any training and consultant fees, administrative support, equipment and supplies, services, conference expenses, and then there's an other category. I encourage you to look closely at the instructions for the other category so that you're using that appropriately. One thing that I think can be a little confusing to applicants when you are submitting a collaborative project is that the funds only get dispersed to the lead applicant. And again, those applicants have to be either from US or Canada. The funds don't get dispersed to the multiple organizations. It's up to the lead applicant to then disperse the funds appropriately, as listed in your budget details and your budget narratives, to those multiple organizations that are collaborating on the project. That can be very confusing. Sometimes collaborators are like, where's my money? They've got to talk to the lead applicant to get that. Another thing that we'll talk about in just a second too is cost shares. You do not need to include cost sharing as part of CLEAR's Digitizing Hidden Collections grant funds. You can if you want, and we'll talk about where that's appropriate to include, but you don't need to. If you're going to be including cost shares, say money that your organization is kicking in to help support this grant, you don't need to put that into the budget detail. You'll be mentioning that in the budget narrative. And for Canadian applicants, those budget detail spreadsheets always need to be in US dollars. So while you're putting your budget together, you'll be wanting to look at Appendix A. Appendix A has those lists of allowable costs and disallowed costs. And again, this is the area that Sharon mentioned that many of you really need to spend some time looking at. And this is a really key thing that we see in grant applications is where somebody has not taken the time to look at the allowable and disallowed costs, and they've put in a lot of disallowed costs, which in many cases can be a trigger for not accepting that project. So allowable costs, we'll go through these. Staff salaries, wages, and benefits, we've talked about those before. Those have to be included under those salaries and wages heading in line items in your budget. And as we said before, in your budget narrative, which we'll talk about in a second, that permanent staff funding has to be justified. That said, there's no maximum for what you can request to support staff salaries. I say that, but I also want to note that this is primarily a digitization grant. So be thinking thoughtfully about how you are allotting your cost to the grant project. It can trigger some alarm bells depending on the project when you have highly weighted other costs than those supporting the outcome of the grant in your budget to other items. So just think about that carefully as you're thinking about how to assign your budget expenditures. You can include costs for training for staff. So say you're hiring student employees or staff who've never done projects like this before. You can include costs for, say, bringing in a consultant to help train your staff or somebody specifically trained to do the work that you want them to do. There's no maximum for that as well. For collaborative projects, those could include consultant fees like honoraria. Say you're working with a tribal organization and you want to equitably compensate tribal cultural heritage consultants for their time. You can include those fees there. Collaborative projects, speaking of collaborative projects, are the only area in which administrative support can be supported for personnel who are coordinating or implementing the project. So again, that expenditure cost, that budget line item has to just be for somebody who is dedicated that time that they're taking to dedicate to managing and coordinating the project. And coordination could be setting up meetings, could be setting up, travel costs for consultants to come in. That kind of time we want to see equitably compensated for someone who needs to be doing that work. You can also include costs for equipment and supplies that you might need for digitization, metadata, or even rehousing of the original physical items. And we'll note in just a second that as we go through some of the other costs that this is a grant that supports both in-house or either in-house digitization or outsourcing digitization to a vendor, which is if your organization has the capacity to do that and you need additional supplies that you don't already have to complete this work, you can include that in your costs. There is a maximum cost for $15,000. So do note again, when you're putting together your budget spreadsheets, where there's no maximum cost and where there is a maximum cost. It will trigger a warning on the review side if you have exceeded those areas where there are maximum costs. Other allowable costs could be that kind of other drop down that I mentioned. Those other services could include digitization vendors, and we'll talk through that in a second. As I said, the digitization can be done in-house or you can outsource it to a vendor. It could be renting equipment. Say you're going to do it in-house, but you need to have rent equipment that you don't currently have to get this done. It can include server time or those one-time costs for ingesting your the product, the digital files that are being produced during this grant into a digital preservation system. That can be covered by this. Just something to keep in mind is ingest into a digital preservation system. That's just for a one-time ingest. It's not going to support costs past the end of the grant period. And there's no max on those other services, so keep that in mind too. I mentioned again that funds for travel are also allowed, and there's no maximum for that as well. That's different from conference travel. So for conference travel, it has to be specifically related to outreach about the project, and there is a maximum of 7,500 for that cost. So the other travel on the bullet point above, that could include the travel that you need to undertake to go and visit your collaborators, to bring in those consultants or trainers, any other funds that are necessary to complete that project. And we'll talk in a little bit about those budget justifications because you are going to have to justify every single line item that you put into your budget detail. So keep that in mind. If you don't think you can adequately explain why you need a line item that you put into your budget detail spreadsheet, it's probably best not to include it because you're going to have to. One thing that CLEAR does not cover, and for larger institutions, especially academic institutions, this can be kind of a surprise. CLEAR does not cover indirect costs, so I want to be really clear about that right now. So for those who aren't familiar with what indirect costs are usually kind of the overhead that it would take to just generally run your organization. Say, furniture, space, heating, lighting, electricity, those sort of costs. CLEAR is not going to cover that. At my institution, University of Colorado Boulder, this is something that generally is required, that indirect costs are included in grants. And I know when I've written grants where, like CLEAR, there is no indirect costs allowed, I do have to fill out a waiver with my institution to say this is not an organization that supports including indirect costs into grants. So keep that in mind. And that is because CLEAR is not a federal funding agency. So let's go through some of these disallowed costs. And I'm going to be really clear that I'm not going through every single one here. I'm going through the ones that are kind of most common in terms of things that get added to grants that are not allowed. So again, at the very top, indirect costs are not allowed in this grant. Also, I've seen this occasionally. There's a tendency sometimes for people to just put in miscellaneous costs or contingency costs, like a little buffer, don't do that. You've got to justify and make sure you're detailing every single cost that you've got in your budget detail spreadsheet. So if you've got something that's miscellaneous, look at it again, make sure you're describing exactly what it is, and make sure it matches the allowed costs on Appendix A. Likewise, you cannot include costs for so-called general purpose items. So anything, equipment, project furniture, for instance, lighting, that's going to be used after the project. This has to be specifically for this project. Also for this one, I know that sometimes there's, especially if you're maybe not as familiar with what you have in your collection, some people might want to include a collection assessment to kind of identify what they need to be, the films that they want to be, or other materials that they want to be digitized as a part of this project. Unfortunately, CLEAR cannot fund that collection assessment. That work really needs to be done before your project is submitted. And then really in-depth conservation or preservation beyond stabilization, cannot do that as well. The materials can be stabilized, and in some instances might need to be prior to digitization, but it's just that kind of basic stabilization needed prior to the digitization process. So it's not going to be funding very detailed conservation, in-depth conservation. Likewise, we do not fund film or film transfer. So forgive me for saying film just a second ago. That's not what I meant. And oral history collection is not funded except if it's necessary for metadata creation. So if you are including oral history collection in your costs, make sure you're justifying it and make sure you're noting that it's necessary because it's going to help your institution or your partners create that metadata as part of this project. A few other things that I just want to point out. If there's extensive processing work that needs to be done during or before digitization, CLEAR is not going to be funding that as well. Same with any sort of data recovery that you need for born digital materials. CLEAR doesn't cover that as well. It does not cover copyright assessment or research. I know that rights is a massive part of this grant. Unfortunately, this cannot be covered. The assessment of those rights cannot be covered by this grant. And unfortunately, it does not cover tuition reimbursement for student employees. So keep that in mind as well if you're including student employees into your grant costs. We've got about 5 more minutes before our break, so I'm gonna go through maybe just a slide or two more, and then we'll be taking a break at 2:45. So I keep mentioning this budget narrative. The budget narrative is the other thing that you're going to be uploading. And this is the written section of the budget where you are going back and you are explaining every single line item in your budget spreadsheet, and you're justifying why you need to the funds to support these costs. So we'll get into as much as we can in the next couple minutes, but we may need to pause for our break. So again, I mentioned at the beginning that the budget detail spreadsheet is required. Budget narrative template is not required, but I strongly recommend using it because it's already broken down into those sections, those drop-down menu sections of, say, salary, wages, fringe benefits, consultant fees, et cetera, et cetera. So please consider using that. I think it'll make your life a lot easier as an applicant. And for each line item, as I said before, every single line item that you have in your budget detail needs to be explained. And not only justified, but explain how that you arrived at that cost, because that can also be a really confusing thing for reviewers. If you're putting in, say, a cost for training, say you put in a $3,000 cost for training, and in the grant narrative, in the budget narrative, you are explaining why you need it, but you didn't explain how you arrived at that cost. That's going to trigger some warnings as well for reviewers. So make sure you're always, for every single line item, explain how you arrived at that cost. Can be just a brief mention, and then again, why you need it. Justify those costs. There are very, very detailed instructions in the application guidelines, and I'd very, very highly recommend that you take a look at them and follow them very, very closely. I believe that would be on about page 32 of the application guidelines. And those instructions break everything down by those line items and describe exactly what you need to put in the budget narrative. A couple key things to remember before we take our break is that, I just want to check on time, there we go. If you're using vendors, we're going to get into vendors in just a second, but if you're going to be outsourcing your digitization to vendors, you need to include a brief rationale for why you decided to select that vendor, and also a description of the costs. And we'll get into some of the other requirements you're going to need to submit for uploading subcontractor quotes and vendor quotes in just a second. I did mention that you do not have to outsource your digitization to vendors. You can do in-house digitization and metadata creation. And I should also say that vendors can be used for metadata creation as well, not just digitization. So in-house digitization and metadata creation is also allowed. If your institution has the capacity to do that, it is allowed. But you do need to, this can be a tricky thing for institutions that have the capacity to do their own digitization and metadata in-house. You do need to explain your cost estimates and what those are covering. Cost share is not required, but if you are going to use it, this is the place where you need to explain it. And there is a section where you can add that in the budget narrative template. So again, strongly recommended that you use that and explain what that means. So I'll give you an example. Say you are using in-house metadata creation, but you're not going to put that into the narrative or the budget detail rather. You know that your current staffing can support it, can be added into their current workflows. Great. Maybe you want to highlight that you're going to be kind of counting your cost share as the salary time, benefit time that those staff members are going to be working on that project. So again, you're not requesting it from CLEAR, but you're just saying, you know, my institution is supporting this in another way. But again, that's not required. You do need to explain how the lead applicant is managing this grant and what that's going to look like. So make sure that you're addressing that in that template. And then lastly, before we take a break, I just want to make sure that Canadian applicants, lead applicants, are aware that you do in this narrative need to explain the conversion and exchange rate and how you arrived at that. So make sure you're noting that. It's just because we are all aware that exchange rates change over time. So this should be obviously the exchange rate at the time of your application. So I'm going to stop sharing right now, and I believe we'll toss it back to CLEAR for our break.
And we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we should be back here at 2:51. See you.
All right. Hope you guys got a brief break. This is a lot to digest. Only got a few more slides, and then we'll be turning it over to the Q&A, and I'm already seeing some good questions in the chat. Okay, let me get back to my slides here. All right, so continuing with that budget narrative and other things to remember. So again, if you're a private foundation lead applicant, you do need to spend some time with those additional funding justifications. Again, this is your place in the budget narrative to identify your major funding sources and talk about why the project can't be supported with those current funds. And then for collaboration applications, again, this is where you're going to be explaining the distribution of funds and emphasizing how you are equitably supporting and benefiting all of the partners with the funding that you're requesting. And if one partner is going to be funded significantly more than others, again, this is where you want to explain why and why that funding difference will still benefit every single partner involved in the project. All right, we're getting towards some of the final pieces. If you are going to be using vendors for digitization or metadata, there is a place in the application where you will be uploading those subcontracts, those kind of estimates and contracts that you're getting. So as I mentioned, the program allows for either in-house digitization projects or projects that are outsourced. And there are some guidelines in your application packet for grant proposals that involve subcontractors or consultants. I already saw a question about that in the Q&A. Make sure you're taking a really close look at that, and the QR code is here to give you those guidelines. So when you're uploading the service estimate and quotes, something that you need to remember is you only need to do that if the service proposal exceeds $5,000. Now for this grant, I'm quite sure that in most cases it will. I'd be surprised if it didn't. But if it's under, you're all set. Just make sure you're justifying that in your budget narrative and you're still including that budget cost in your line items in your budget detail. But if it exceeds $5,000, again, put that into your budget detail narrative and then, or budget detail spreadsheet. And then in the budget narrative, write your justification about why you selected this vendor specifically. And this is a really key thing. How is that vendor going to respect the core values of the project? So if, say, there's some ethical concerns with the material that you are digitizing, is the vendor adequately going to be respecting those privacy concerns or those ethical concerns? I think we see that come up most frequently with indigenous related material. The other thing that we sometimes see coming back with these uploaded estimates and quotes is a vendor who has not listed out on their end or described what is part of the costs. Sometimes we'll see a vendor come back with just it'll say $10,000. Okay, Cool. What is that actually covering? What are the services they're providing? What exactly are those digitization specs? Do those digitization specs match what Clear is looking for? You need to have quotes that are coming that you're uploading from your service providers that are delineating, breaking down all of the costs, not just that overall cost. So make sure when you're looking closely at those quotes when you're getting them back from your vendors, and you can always go back to them and say, hey, you know what? I noticed that you didn't break down this cost adequately for Clear. Can you send me another one that's got this cost breakdown? Because the Clear reviewers are going to be looking for that. So a couple final thoughts as we go into the Q&A, just things again that I've said over and over again that are really important to remember. Again, connecting even your whole entire application needs to be reflecting back on those core values of the program. But you really have to remember that's still a part of the staffing and budget too. So where requested throughout the instructions and the application guidelines, keep going back to those core values, especially the 3 that I highlighted at the beginning of this presentation, and make sure you're always reflecting back on how your costs are supporting those core values. You need to be demonstrating the need for support. If you're not adequately demonstrating on a very basic level why you need these funds, your application is not going to be successful. So demonstrate, as I've said before, how this builds off existing funding that you already have, or how it's filling a hole that you couldn't do this project if you didn't have these funds. And you also need to be making sure that your staffing for this project supports your ability to complete the project. So be thinking through that too. That's another thing that we often see is like an applicant applies and they're not thinking through who's going to be doing every single piece of the project outcomes throughout the grant. And I keep hammering this 3rd bullet point home. Every single cost mentioned anywhere in your grant application needs to match every single other place where you're mentioning those costs. Your budget detail spreadsheet needs to match the budget narrative, which also needs to match other areas in the narrative applications where you're mentioning costs. So make sure you're going through with a fine-tooth comb right before you submit it, or maybe not right before you submit it, but throughout your pre-submission process to make sure everything is matching up, because the reviewers will catch that. And I can say some reviewers are much more adept at catching those costs. There's always at least one reviewer in your panel who's going to be looking at those and looking for those discrepancies. And again, make sure you're justifying all of the costs in the narrative sections. And one final thing that I haven't mentioned yet is in your application guidelines, the very end of the application guidelines, it's very, very transparent what rubric the reviewers are going to be using when they're reviewing your grant application. Take a look at that. Once you've got your application completed, especially for those staffing and budget sections, look at those application review rubrics and look at how the reviewers are going to be rating this. And it's very, very clear what we're looking for, how we rate things when things are missing that should be part of that, and kind of what happens if like big sections and chunks are missing. You've really got to make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. And as I've said before, really when it comes down to grants, it's all about following instructions, making sure you're reading through this very, 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 very lengthy application guideline, and especially for staffing and budget, that you're being very, very critical about looking to see that everything that you're uploading, everything that you're writing matches the instructions in the application, and especially matches those allowed costs, and that you're not including any of those disallowed costs. So I think that's about it on my end. I just wanted to mention just a couple resources. I did throw in some web links here with those core values, the application guidelines, and then of course the application form, which is also linked in the packet. All of the other QR codes that are in here are for things that are in the application guidelines or linked in the application guidelines. So I think now I can stop sharing. Let me make sure. Yep, that was the end of my slide. So I'm going to stop sharing, and we're actually a little ahead of schedule, so we've got more time to talk.
Thanks, Megan. We're going to get into questions now. If we run out of time to answer all of our questions today, We'll be sure to provide written answers in the Q&A document that will be posted alongside the recording on the Apply for an Award page. Please note that we'll be holding a full hour-long session dedicated to questions and answers on April 10th as well. That will be the final session of this series. Sharon, you want to kick us off? And Megan, we'll read these to you. If there's ones that you think are more appropriate to be answered by the program officer, you can say that. We'll just bandy them back and forth if that works.
Yeah.
First question. In the document Guidelines for Grant Proposals Involving Subcontractors or Consultants, on page 3 it states, all consultants and subcontractors should sign confidentiality and work for hire agreements where applicable, and affirm that they have no conflicts of interest. Our project will involve an Internet Archive vendor who will be performing scanning work. Do they need to sign an agreement too? And do you have a template for such agreements, or do we use our own?
I think that may be a question for Claire.
That's probably a program question.
Yeah.
That is definitely a program officer question. So for me, we don't have a template that I know of, Allison, but we do, give you suggestions, because for each organization and what's required for your organization is going to vary from institution to institution. So you should use your own. You should explain it greatly in detail how much you're paying them, what services they're going to provide for you, and also explain this in your budget narrative. And if you're paying them over $5,000, then you'll have to submit a quote from them anyway, which would have this information. So you're outsourcing to a digitization vendor would still apply for the information that Megan spoke to in her presentation about the cost ratio that you want to define. What will they be doing? What details? How much per page or per item, and what those levels will be? That will be in there too. Anything you want to add to that, Allison?
Yeah, I think in terms of that aspect of the guidelines too, like some of this stuff are things that we require, and some of them are recommendations of best practices, and that's more on the recommendations of best practices side, where like these would be documents that you all would hold internally to your administration of the project. They would not be something that you would submit to us, like a confidentiality agreement from your vendor would not be something that we would require you to submit as part of your proposal.
Next question. How much additional detail are you looking for in the final application regarding capacity, assuming there was nothing flagged in the initial grant feedback? Megan, I think you explained some of this earlier. If you wanted to expand on it a little bit.
Yeah, so I think the key thing for grants like this, where you've done an initial application, then you're moving on to a final round, is to make sure that you're still addressing this. Don't think that, oh, I covered this in the first round, so I don't have to talk about this again. Within the 700 words that you've got, you still need to be addressing your capacity. You still need to be relating it back to the core values. You still need to be answering that question.
This next one, I'm going to read and answer because I do think it's probably a program question. Hello, should we include resumes or CVs for contractors or vendors? You don't have to include resumes or CVs. You would just need to include the quote if it is over $5,000. However, if you were using like a specialized vendor that you have a relationship with who is perhaps not necessarily like nationally known, you may want to supply some additional information about them or justification for why they're your choice.
Hello, if you send me a quote to create a proposal in Spanish, can I include it, or do I have to translate it into English? I guess it's for a vendor, and yes, most of our reviewers will speak English, so we would probably need it translated.
If we're applying for a multi-year grant, are you expecting annual cost of living pay increases for each staff member?
So I would say this is not required, but it's great to include this. Again, that's demonstrating that equity piece of it. And I know for some institutions that actually is required. So my institution, I'm at an academic institution, we're required to include that in grants, especially multi-year grants. Our benefits rates change every single year, and so we work with our grant office to estimate out what those are going to be. Obviously, if you're a smaller institution that doesn't quite think in those terms, you're not required to do this, but it's gonna really demonstrate those core values if you're thinking about that. And kind of think through what that percentage would be, look for equitable, other cost of find a measure that you can of cost of living increases that you can use that's you're not pulling out of thin air. So I don't know if the program staff want to add to that at all.
Yeah, if you're thinking about doing that or know that you're going to have to do that, it makes more sense. Because once we issue the funds, you don't get additional funds down the road. So it would make more sense to include that in your initial budget as opposed to trying to move funds around later down the road.
Megan, you spoke to this a little bit. If you could maybe elaborate, is there a preference for using funds for current staff rather than hiring part-time positions?
There's no preference, but you do, again, just have to be justifying, going the extra mile to justify those costs for current staff, and making sure that the grant funds are just covering their time on the project. It can't be covering their full salary. So I know at my institution, we have like a percentage rate that we use for how much time would be spent on the grant as opposed to other time for other work duties. So think about that. And then, it's a balance, right? Those part-time positions, there's an inherent precariousness with them. There's labor considerations you might want. And so maybe your institution's like, you know what? I don't feel good from an equity perspective about hiring a limited term part-time position. So maybe you do want to use current staff. And then there's that third option, which is hiring a permanent staff member who might continue beyond the grant. But remember, the funds are only available for that person for the grant project during the duration of the grant. So you might need to be demonstrating the sustainability of that position past the grant.
If student salaries are supported by our existing student employee budget, should we still include a JD for student employees? I'm thinking that's a justification.
Job
Okay.
description,
Yeah.
I think.
Description. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Do you want to get this next one, Allison?
Yeah, I think this is a good Megan one. If we have in-house digitization staff slash equipment that would allow us to do the project more cost effectively than with a vendor, would it be appropriate for the whole budget to be staff time?
Okay. Yes-ish. I think it's the whole budget that's throwing me a little bit on that. If your whole entire budget for the whole entire grant is going to be spent on digitization, that's cool. That's good. But you need to really be talking about why you're not spending money on anything else. When all of the grant funds are only going to kind of one type of budget line item, that can trigger a little extra discussion on the reviewer's end about whether the applicant is really thoroughly considering other costs that might come up as a part of the project. So think about that. And again, when you're budgeting for that in-house digitization work, you need to be only budgeting for the time that those staff members are spending on the project. So again, you cannot be paying their whole entire salary for a year to work on this and other projects. So just be careful with this and make sure that you are appropriately thinking about other costs associated with this, like metadata creation, for instance. You didn't mention that. So I'd just be careful about allotting your whole entire budget to one kind of lump line item.
Maybe charge overhead to cover employee benefits. Megan, did you want us to answer that or?
I mean, the employee benefits need to be included in and it's only, so again, if these are current employees who are going to be working on the project, those current employee, it's a percentage of, it's not their whole entire benefits, right? If you're allotting 25% of their time, that's 25% of their salary and 25% of their current benefits. So, overhead is a really tricky word because usually overhead means indirect costs, and we've been pretty clear that indirect costs are not covered. So I don't know if program staff want to add anything to that.
Yeah, we saw some application issues in the initial round that we didn't necessarily DQ, but no indirect costs. So we're not paying for space, rental space for your uh, or utilities or any of those type of things. Those are disallowed costs. But fringe benefits, yes, for the appropriate FTE for the time that the employee or staff will be working on the project.
And then the next one, I'll take this one. Megan spoke to this a little bit, but just to clarify, because this is more of a programming limit. If a symposium or conference about the subject of the newly available digitized material using the digitized items as a component of the symposium is planned as an outreach activity, is the max for this activity $7,500? No. $7,500 is the conference travel max. So that means if you're going to go to a conference or conferences during a multi-year grant to present on your work, the travel has to be under, the travel, registration, hotels, etc. has to be under $7,500. What you're describing is an outreach activity, and that is not the same category and would not fall under the same limit. Like you're doing education, promotion, and outreach. You're not doing conference travel, so you would not be limited by that max.
When we submit personnel costs, is it acceptable to include a year-to-year increase for a 24-month or 36-month grant? I think we already answered that, and the answer is yes.
Can projects that engage indigenous tribes as consultants allow the tribes to determine the cost for their services within the budget? My institution has a monetary limit on honorariums, which may not adequately reflect the value of the tribe's work on the project.
Yes, 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 and yes. You just need to justify that and explain it. I'm in the same boat as you. My institution has a max on honorariums, which is not acceptable to many of us in terms of our work with tribal consultants. So yes, if you are reaching out to your collaborator in a tribal organization and you're asking for what's an appropriate compensation, make sure that you reflect that in your budget narrative as to how you arrived at that cost.
We will be using decades-old equipment to do some of the digitization for our project. Some of these machines have been in more or less continuous use since the 1980s and need frequent repairs and or parts replacements. Would it be reasonable to include an estimated cost for a portion of the cost of machine upkeep during the project as part of the budget?
I think I'll let program staff answer this one.
There's a $15,000 limit for equipment and supplies, which could include buying some new equipment. And then when we see people buy new equipment, sometimes they add the service for those.
Yeah, sometimes people have service subscriptions,
Yeah.
and that's allowed.
Yeah.
So if you have like a maintenance or repair service subscription, perhaps,
Yeah.
that could be an easy way to.
So to put that in there, and it would be under services and vendors if it's more than 5,000.
But
And
yeah, if you could replace equipment, which I know is not necessarily, there's some equipment that cannot be replaced, you could do that under your supplies budget.
yeah, you could do that. And just make sure you explain it clearly in your budget area. Okay, this next question has 3 parts. The 15K max that Megan referred to for rehousing materials, would acid-free folders for refiling materials post-digitization fall under that category? Second question is, in the work plan, can I include references to non-funded activities, i.e. activities that aren't allowed to be funded through CLEAR, but that are part of our work plan? 3, collection assessment is not allowed. Would post-digitization collection assessment be allowed to decide how to further break down our collections into sub-collections on the website?
I think I can at least take number 1 and then maybe toss it back to you guys for 2 and 3. 1, yes, for sure. But there's something that I do want to just mention, which is it's not a bad idea to explain somewhere in your budget narrative, very briefly, what housing the materials currently are in. It's not a big trigger if we see acid-free folders or rehousing. I think there will come up. There'll just be a question of how they're currently maintained and housed in your current archive. It's not a make or break for the application itself, but you just might want to mention why you specifically need the acid-free folders.
I will take the work plan. You're not prohibited from including non-funded activities that are related to the project. I would be very clear about how you do that, similar to how Megan discussed some ways of like considering in-kind cost share. I just want you to be clear. I want the relationship between your work plan, your budget narrative, and your budget detail to be clear. So if there's pieces in the work plan that are not funded from the grant, I want there to be clarity there so the panel can easily see the difference between what is being funded institutionally and what is being funded through the grant. And what was the third one? Sorry, that was a lot of
I'm
questions.
sorry, collection assessment is not allowed. Would post-digitization collection assessment be allowed to decide how to further break down our collections into sub-collections on the website?
I think this is a matter of what you're doing and how you describe it. Primarily when we're talking about collections assessments, we're talking about external collections assessments that you're like paying a consultant or like an IP specialist to assist with. And I think what you're talking about is maybe more like systems design. It could be a form of metadata. I would not consider this an automatically disallowed cost, but I would also not necessarily refer to it as collection assessment because I don't think it fits what we mean when we say collection assessment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Allison. I wouldn't call it collections assessment. I think you're talking about detailing your metadata into a very specific sub-collections.
Like
I
this
would,
could just be regular post-processing in some ways.
and if you're using, if you're using an outside vendor, then I would have them maybe fold that under their quote also. Or it could be under
If
staff.
that's not a good answer because we're not understanding clearly what you need, you can feel free to email us in the program box hiddencollections@clear.org so we can kind of
We'll need
more
more.
precisely define what we're talking about.
Okay, this one says, our plans call for outreach within multiple communities in another country by a scholar consultant. The scholar's trips are not conferences, but are specifically dedicated to project outreach within multiple communities. Does the 7,500 travel maximum apply to this? Or does the 7,500 only apply? The 7,500 only applies to conferences. However, you're going to have to be fiscally responsible in your project narrative, defining and explaining and justifying why you need to spend a certain amount of money for your outreach. The review panelists, and Megan can expand on this further, but the review panel is going to want to see a budget narrative in detail that makes sense, and that the primary funds are going according to how you described in your work plan. So they don't want it to be too extensive in one area and not enough extensiveness in the other areas. And so, yes, you can go above that for travel, but you must explain it and justify it clearly.
And Sharon, I would follow that up with a question about whether the costs are allowed for travel outside the US or Canada. Can you use grant funds outside of this, as I note that that person says another country?
We have not limited conference travel funds to the US or Canada. So I don't believe that
Yeah, I've never seen this, but I don't see it being a problem. We've never said you can't go to this place or you can't go. You just have to stay within the
the
country.
materials have to be in the country to be digitized. The digitization has to occur here. No one has asked us this before, but I don't believe it's disallowed. If we know who we will hire for a term position, do we also need to upload a corresponding job description in addition to their resume?
Okay, this is a really interesting question, and I've seen this come up in grant reviews in the past. Okay, a little complicated, and maybe program staff can jump in to help. I think my question is, if you already know who you're going to hire, is this someone who already exists within your organization and that you're hiring them for sort of additional duties? If so, and they're already exist in your organization, and it's not an additional position, it's just additional duties, I think you can just upload their resume or CV. But I'm a little bit curious about this. If it's a position that's not yet been created, I think you may just want to consider some equity issues with that. That's come up a couple times in grants that I've reviewed in the past. Just think of that from an equity perspective. You may just need to do a little work to justify hiring that person into a new position. You might need to talk about this is supposed to be a competitive hire, right? So if you've got already somebody in mind, or you already know you're going to just hand this job to someone, I think you need to talk about that a little bit more, but I'll ask program staff to clarify that point.
It doesn't hurt to
So
add a job description to it too.
I would also note sometimes there's discrepancy. I'm not sure exactly what the circumstances are. But sometimes you're using like an archival professional or something, and you're really using them as a consultant. You're not hiring them. We see this a lot where these people are under salary, but they're really like they're a consultant. They're providing an outside service, and you want to you want to categorize them appropriately in the budget detail, etc., as not your employee, just in case that's kind of the instance that we're working with here.
Yeah, because you want to make sure that the salary is commensurate with their experience and the work that they're doing. And our reviewers will see that right away. Do we need to include the entire project budget or just the requested amount? Megan was saying before that a request for just salaries was concerning, but what if the applicant was asking clear for funding for salaries only if project costs far exceed that? Megan, did you want to answer or you want us to do it?
Oh, sorry, I was just scrolling down to find this since I think it was at the bottom of my Q&A. Let me just read through this really quickly. Okay. What if the applicant was just asking clear for funding for salaries only? Oof. You still need to, you really have to address, I mean, this is a digitizing hidden collections grant, right? You're still going to need to address the digitization piece of this. If it's handled, your institution's handling that as no additional cost, that's kind of a cost share, right? You're going to probably want to at least mention that. We said that cost shares aren't required, but yeah, it's going to trigger some alarm bells if you're just including salaries and you're not talking at all about how that digitization piece is going to be handled funding wise. So again, though, like if they're other parts of the project that maybe don't have as much bearing, that your institution is going to have that cost, bear that cost, but it's not going to affect the rest of the budget all that much. You may not need to include those. Again, cost shares are not required to be included. But yeah, if you're just putting salaries in there and you're not explaining how the project itself is going to be funded, the actual work, that's a big red flag.
Yeah, remember to hit your core values, and outreach is one of them, authentic partnerships. So, explain that and its cost share of what activities you'll be doing to promote those core values, and what is the cost share for that. They're going to want to see more than just digitization.
I do want to take a quick moment to clarify around cost share, and I think this may be the last question that we can take. As Megan described, if you're doing this project costs more than you're asking for, you would want to talk about that cost share in your budget narrative. You will talk about that cost share in your budget narrative, and if you assign an amount of money to that cost share, do not include it in your budget narrative total, and do not include that money in your budget detail. So we want to know that you are doing a cost share. It's very important that you explain that in your narrative, but do not include it in your budget detail, because then your budget detail will not match your award request amount.
Exactly. We did see some of that too in the initial round. Your project asks, your budget narrative, and your budget detail should all be the same amount, and it should
total.
not be over $300,000.
So please tell us about your cost share, but please don't add it into your totals. I think I'll have to put up our wrap-up slide. We're about out of time.
So we just have a few quick reminders before we end. First, we want to check in with you again about today's topic, and I'm going to cross my fingers and hope that we can do the poll this time. Are you seeing it on your end? I think it's going. You can take a moment to complete that. Great. Great. Thank you so much. Looks like we're good to go. Thank you for your feedback. As you work on your final application, remember there is one final session, which will be the Q&A session on April 10th. You can sign up for that session using the registration link on our Apply for an Award page. We're so glad that you were able to join us today, and we want to extend a huge thanks for Megan for leading us. As we continue our assessment of the program, we appreciate your continued feedback, and we've shared the link to our survey for today's webinar in the chat. We look forward to hearing how this session went, how we might improve, and please don't hesitate to send questions to the Clear Grants team as they come up between now and the final submission deadline of May 5th. And I realized I said the 10th for the next webinar. It is the 9th. Wednesday the 9th. All right, thank you so much, and we hope to see you next week.